Hello, and welcome back to our series on learning Google App Scripts for HR, brought to you by Prairie-HR-Solutions, where we believe knowledge should be shared and in empowering our fellow HR professionals to truly rethink how we deliver our HR services and solutions by utilizing tools that we may already have at our disposal. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie-HR-Solutions, and in this video, I would like to continue on with our user interface project for our employee database. So to catch everyone up who may have missed some of the previous videos, we created a sidebar that is accessed by a custom toolbar item up here. We can click on HR interface, hit open sidebar. It will run a script that we created and it will pull up this sidebar here. And what this sidebar does at this point is a user is able to enter data. We'll go Smith, Joe, accounting. Joe's our CFO. Joe makes about 125K a year. And we added in this date selector for our hire date and a record action drop down box that a user can select. And what the intent of this drop down box is going to be is depending on what selection the user selects, will dictate which function this button here runs. But for now, it's pretty isolated and ineffective, but we will add more to that as we continue to build out our thing. And then once we hit record, it takes this input data and sends it over to our server side, our Google Apps side, which is hidden from view, and then populates that data into our secured Google Sheet. So what we did essentially was create a record. Now what I would like to do is to create a function using this same sidebar to retrieve a record. And when we think about retrieving a record, it is best to think of it operationally. What is it that we're truly trying to accomplish? And then filling the steps in to ensure that is essentially accomplished. And what I mean by that is we want to get specific employee data, which in our case is in the form of a row. Now, for those of us who have been in HR, we realize that using the last name as an identifier to get data or get a record isn't terribly efficient because we can have multiple people with the same last name. Let's think of Smith or Jones. So if we just go through and want to search, envision yourself searching through a physical file, and then you get to the J's, and you're like, okay, I have this Jones, I have this Jones, I have these Jones here. You're having to then look for a secondary piece of information, which would be the first name. And how many Jane Smiths can we have? You can have quite a bit if you get up to a large employee base. This is where our employee number becomes so important. An employee number is designed to be a very unique identifier for an individual employee. So we're not going to have an employee number, say 15, that is assigned to Joan Finger, but also Joe Smith. So it should be identifying only a single employee. And this is perfect for our purpose because we could isolate that employee number and use that to retrieve the appropriate row. So when we think about retrieving, especially when we're talking about coding, what we need to do is search through our sheet here. And in our case, it's going to be this column. We want to search for a specific number. Once we find that number, we would then want to select that row and pull all the data from only that row. And then we want to send it back to our HTML side, which is our sidebar here. And then depending on what column, And if you remember, our columns and our data are in the form of an array, and each element in that array is at a specific index. So when we talk about columns, what we're really talking about is the index of that array. What we want to do is go through and grab each index or column and then populate that in the appropriate box. So we want finger, the last name, to be in the last name box. We want the division to populate in the correct division box. And we can do this because our data is in the form of an array. We just need to isolate each element after we get the appropriate row. So that's what this focus is going to be on this episode. And we do this initially by creating a new function. Because what we're wanting to do here is isolate our employee number. So we need to create a function to search through this and grab this employee number. But first, we need to grab the employee number that is entered here, because this is how our user is going to retrieve the data. If they're wanting to pull, say, Joan Fingers data, they're going to need to know her employee number, which is 15. And then what we're wanting is the user to be able to hit 15, click a button, and then populate all that data. So first, we're going to need to go over to our HTML side. So here is our HTML code. And what we're going to need to do is come up and grab whatever value is in this input box, which is our employee number box. So to do that, if you remember, right, we've already done that for our create record, which is right here. We're going to need to grab the document, get the element by the ID and the employee number. So actually, we could just copy this, but let's go down here and create another function. And let's call this function, let's think of a descriptive name here. We can call this function retrieve record. It's not going to take an argument at this point. But what we initially wanted to do is to grab that employee number, the value of it, and let's store this into a variable. And let's call this variable, let's just call it employee number for now. Now remember, we can use the same variable name in different functions just because of how we are using our variables. Our variables are local and they're only within these functions. To keep it clean though, let's call this retrieve employee number, just so we can ensure that it is part of a different function, just to keep it less confusing. So now we have this variable that is storing the value from this employee number. Now what we want to do with that variable is send it over to our Google Apps side, our server side, our code side over here. So to do that, we can actually use this script line right here. So if you remember right, this is HTML's way of saying, I am now going to be dealing with Google Apps Script on the server side, and I need to run this Google Apps Script, which exists on the server side, function. And what I'm going to pass to that function is my variable that contains my data. So we can simply just copy this and then change where it needs to go. So we're not actually going to send any data to our record data because we're not recording data. But what we can do is just simply call this, let's call this function retrieve data, because that's really what it's going to be doing. And we're not sending a record. What we're doing is sending the value of this variable. Okay, good. So now we are pulling this variable, pulling the value of this ID, storing it in this variable, sending this variable over to our server side, to this function here. And what we need to do now, though, is this function is not running. There's no way for us to actually trigger this function. So if you remember right, this function here was triggered by this piece of code right here. And what this piece of code is doing is telling the document, in this case, our HTML page, to listen to this element by this ID, which is our button up here. And when it hears a click, then it runs this function. So what we need to do is create the same exact set of instructions for that new function. So what we can do is we can just create simply another button. Again, we will consolidate this down to where we don't want to have a user search through buttons to click, because that lends the opportunity for a user to inadvertently erase a record or update a record when they're really wanting to create or retrieve it. But for now, for illustration purposes, we'll just simply create another button. And instead of record button, we'll call this retrieve button. And instead of record, we want it to show, spell it right, retrieve. So now instead of listening to this record button, we still want it to do it, but we don't need to do it twice. We want our code to also listen for a click on this retrieve button. And when it hears that click, we want it to run this function right here. So let's go ahead and test this out. And if you remember from the earlier versions, what we did was we tested it by having it pull up a simple alert. So let's comment this out real quick, because we don't want this to run because this function here doesn't exist yet. Let's do an alert and just simply notify us that this function is executing correctly. So let's save this, and what we'll do is we will go back to our sheet once it gets done saving anyway. Okay, there we go. Not sure what that was about. Well, let's go back to our sheet here, and then let's refresh our sidebar, and we should see two additional buttons. So yep, we have our record, we have our retrieve. Now, it's not really pulling anything. Well, it's pulling anything and storing it into a variable. It's not doing anything with that variable. But what we should see when we hit this retrieve button is the alert pop up saying that it works. Yep, there we go. So what that is meaning is that our document is listening for that button's click, in this case, the retrieve button. And when it hears that, it's running this set of code and it is producing this alert. Good. Good, good. So we're working. So that function there works as intended. So now we can focus on having it send that value over to our script side. Let's go ahead and get rid of this alert. We don't need it. It'll just add to clutter. And then we will uncomment this out. And we'll go over to our code. Now what we're wanting is to create that function that we are sending it to. And that function was called retrieve data. So we need to call it retrieve data. So there's our function, and it is going to accept information in the form of this variable. And we can just leave this variable the same. Let's just grab it and keep that name the same. So now this argument is the value from our HTML side. It is that value. So now what we need to do is we need to, in our function here, we need to tell our function that we want to take that value and we want to search this column. And when we find that column or find that value in this column, we want to select the entire record. And to do this, this function doesn't have access. We haven't allowed it to have access anyway to the data that we already built in this get sheet data. Now we could just rename this get sheet data because it's not really doing anything right now. This was just our test and illustration function, but we can use some of the information over. And I think the next video, what we will do is we'll clean this up a little bit because as you're seeing, we are having to use the same variable over and over again. What we can do is take this and make it a global variable and clean up a little bit. So the next video, we will do that. So what we're doing is we're declaring a variable SS and we're stating to Google that we are using our spreadsheet app. We're getting the active spreadsheet, which is our database. And then we're declaring another variable, this sheet variable, calling on the previous variable. And then in that variable, we are getting a sheet by name called employee data. And our employee data sheet is our employee data tab here. Now we're going to need to get the data because we got to get the data first in order to search through the data. So you'll remember we got this variable here, which was our data. This was a 3 initially. And let's log this employee data variable to see what it is that we retrieve. So let's save that. Once we save it, this retrieved data will be available to us. And this time when we run this, you'll see that we have our two-dimensional array and we have an empty index or column and then a number and then an empty index and column. And the reason we have 3 pieces is because the way getRange, just for a high level overview again, the way getRange works is it starts at a row number, which in our case, we stated that we wanted to start at row 2, then a column 1, and we wanted to go down 3 rows and over 3 rows. So it is doing what we're asking it to do. It's starting here, row 2, column 1, going down 3 rows and over 3 rows. So it's actually getting this block of data right here, which is an empty column, a number, 1.0, empty column. And when we go back to our code here and run it, it is giving us exactly what it is that we want. Well, we want more data than that. What we want is we want it to start at this row here and go all the way over to this row currently. And with this column, this column is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we want it to go down 18 rows. Now we could continue to chase this. Well, for now, we'll do it just for illustration purposes, and then I'll show you a way that we can just get the last row and the last column. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Now, remember, this is row 18, but the reason why we only have 17 is because we're not wanting to count this row up here, our title row. So instead, what we want to start at row 2, column 1. We want to go down 17 rows and over 9 rows. Now, when we run this, you'll see that we'll have a lot more rows. In fact, it goes up to our last row. Now, what would be interesting about this is if we created a new record, our new record would go down one more row, but we're not pulling that row. We're only going down to this row right here. So what we can do is instead of doing this 17, we can get the last row of that data within this sheet. So what we could do is go sheet, let's call that variable. And then what we want to do is get last row. And you see this is a method, so we're going to need the parentheses. My apologies. Let me share the right screen here. What we're wanting to do is get the last row instead of that 17, so we can call our variable, our sheet here, and then we get the last row, and you see it was a method, so we're going to need the parentheses. And what this will do is this will get the last row of that sheet. So now when we run it, you'll see that it goes down to this, but then it creates this empty row. And that's because we're it's including that header, our initial head row right here. So to get away from that, we can actually go in here and hit -1 and then run it. And what that does is that removes that headline and gives it exactly to the end. Now, if we go in here and create yet another record, and then we'll do Jones, Smith, works at, let's just do HQ, and then job title is, we'll just do maintenance, put some data in here, and then hit record. What it'll do is it'll populate, and then when we go back here and run it again, it will run the function and grab that information. It's like I got a slow connection here. Think I tried doing it too fast. Yep, and here we are. See how it picked up that last row. So this is a good piece to remember when we are constantly changing the length of our data in our row. And we can also do this with columns, which we'll get into once we start building out the deeper columns. Okay, good. So we have our employee data. Now what we're wanting to get in that data is we are wanting to get the value essentially of, we are wanting to get the value of this column, and then we're wanting to search through this column to find the value of this variable that we pulled over from our HTML. So to do that, we are going to use what's called IndexOf. And what IndexOf does is you give index a variable or a number or a text, and it searches through a array, and when it finds that number or whatever it is, that variable, that value, when it finds that, it provides back or returns the index of that value. So when we're dealing with an array, let's hit run again. When we're dealing with an array, we know that this piece of information is 0. This is 1, 2, 3. So this is also the index. So the index of will return the index of wherever that information was found. So let's go ahead and illustrate this. Let's close this, comment this out so it doesn't run anymore. And let's create another variable, just a test variable. We will call this test. And we'll make this equal to 3. And let's take our employee data here. And let's go ahead and condense it down, because remember, it is now a 2-dimensional array. And let's condense it down to a 1-dimensional array. And we'll do that. We'll do that by declaring another variable. Let's call this employee number, not employer. Employee number. And let's map this employee data dot map. And map is going to take a function. And remember, up here, we could map 2 different ways. We can either do it with a function or do our arrow function. Because we're learning maps still, I'm going to go ahead and use the longer method, and we can create any term we want to for this in our array. In fact, it can be something as simple as R. So we'll use R for right now, as long as it's just consistently used. So that is going to take the row, R for row, and what this function is going to return is the first element of that secondary array. So what's going to happen here is we are going to take our employee data and we're going to map every single time, and we are only going to pull out the first, in this case, index, the index at number 1, and we are going to thus create a new array. Now let's log this out and see what this produces. And let's hit run. And as you see, it is producing only the first index, which is actually what we want. We want that first index. The reason why I chose 1 instead of, say, 0 is when we run it with 0, it is only going to pull the information at that 0 index, which our 0 index is this. What we're wanting to isolate is our employee number. So what we want is, we don't want the 0, we want the 1. Now our employee number is stored in a variable that goes through this entire sheet data and takes all of the employee numbers, in our case, that column number 2, or that first index, and creates a new array with those. So now what we can do is create an index of, and actually cycle through or loop through this and determine if the value of, in our case, our test variable exists within that data. Now, the way IndexOf returns back the index is it either, if it finds it, it'll return the exact index. If it doesn't find it, it will return a -1. And what that -1 means is that it didn't find that value within that set of data. So I'll show you what I mean. And this is one of these concepts that it may be difficult to grasp at first, but it's great that you'll already have code to do this. As you do it more and more, and you're really thinking operationally about what's occurring and what needs to occur, IndexOf makes a lot more sense. And then you can start getting into the ability to change that IndexOf and use it in different ways, like the first IndexOf or the last IndexOf. But it is very handy to search and match. So let's create a variable and start working with our IndexOf. So let's create a variable called test index. And what we're wanting this variable to be equal to is this employee number, because we stored all of our employee number variables in here after we mapped it. Employee number. And what we want to do is find the index. Here it is right here. It's a method. The index of. Now, for our illustration purposes, we're wanting to find the index of this number right here. We save that in a variable so we can simply put the variable in there. Now, the reason I store this in a variable is because it's going to allow me to log it to see what actually occurs. So let's log out this test index. And when we run this, we will see if 3.0 exists as an employee number. So we'll run that. And as you can see, what it returned was 2. So now if we look up here at our array, it is 0, 1, 2. Good. So now let's see what happens if we pick something that doesn't exist in our data. And I'm going to hopefully get lucky here and pick something that doesn't exist in our data. I don't remember what employee numbers we have, but let's try this and run it. Okay, good. As you can see, when you look in here on our array, we don't have that number. So since it didn't find it, it returned this -1. And the reason why this -1 is so important is because what we can do is do certain things depending on if we get -1 or not. Because if we don't have the data, we can't return data. But we also need to allow the user or notify the user that that number doesn't exist, that maybe they made an error or they got ahead of themselves and are trying to retrieve something that they haven't created. And then if it does find it, then we can run a code. What we can do now is replace our value here, this test value, with the information that we're actually going to be using. If you remember, we're using this variable right here that's coming over from our HTML side. So let's go ahead and get rid of our test data. And then what we're wanting to do is, actually, I think I'm going to confuse y'all if I do it this way. So let's do a different way here. We know that we get a -1 if this doesn't happen. So if this doesn't exist, we get a -1. If it does exist, it returns the index. So what we're wanting to do is check if it is a -1. We want to return something along the lines of, say, not found. If it doesn't equal -1, which means that if it is 0 or higher, then we want it to return the information found at this exact or this index. So what we can simply do is create an if statement. And if you're not familiar with if statements, I can do a separate video. In fact, maybe what I'll do is jump in and create an video at this next or at our next session to kind of dig a little bit more into if. But we're familiar already with if statements. What an if statement is it's a logical step to say, if this, then do this, or else do that. And you'll see what I'm talking about once we get done with this syntax. We'll walk through it and see exactly what it's doing. So what we're wanting to do is if this test index, and let's change this test index to something that we're actually going to use. Let's do imp num index. So we're changing that variable to something that we're actually going to use. So if imp num index is greater than -1, then what we want to run is a block of code. If it's not, else, then we want it to do something else. So what we want to do here is we could actually take this log and copy it. And if it is greater than -1, then it's going to return the index. And if it's not, say it equals -1, we want to return we want to log not found. So now what happens when we run this? It's the same exact thing, except we are already building in. Notice how it didn't say -1. It's actually going through its logical step. It's checking this number, and if it comes back as a -1, it's running this else piece. Now, if we change this to say 2 and hit run, it's going to return that index because it's greater than -1 because it's coming back as a 2, and then it's logging that number. Now we can change this to actually say, I found it. And then when we run it, it's going to produce that log. I found it. So that gives kind of an idea of how this if logical structure works. So now instead of just giving us the number, what we want it to do is actually give us the entire row of information that is found at that row that indexes row. And to do that, we simply don't want to log this out. What we want to do is return, because we want to send that information back to our HTML. So we want to return the full set of data. So employee data that is found at the employee number index. And then we want to not log this. We would like to just return that. And we can return text to say simply not found. And this can change. This can be anything. And then we'll save this. Now this video is getting pretty long. So what I'm going to do is end this video here. And then in the next video, what we will do is we will go over here and do something with the data that was returned. And then we'll populate it inside our appropriate fields here. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And again, if you like what we are providing you, please hit that subscribe button and we can continue to bring content. And I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Take care.